So as the next speaker, I would like to invite Patrick Ryan from American Bureau of Shipping. Now, he's working as a CTO of the ABS, and he has spent 5 years in ABS. And before he joined the ABS, he spent about 21 years in the various areas of the shipbuilding and ship design, including the R&D and digital area and software development. And now the top title of his presentation today is the role of nuclear energy in marine energy transition. Please, Patrick.
Thank you, Dr. Lim. And thank you for hosting me today here in Busan, lovely Busan. Happy to be back. Again, my name is Patrick Ryan. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at the American Bureau of Shipping. And as was included in my introduction, I have a long and proud history of designing nuclear-powered vessels for the United States Navy at the largest shipyard in the United States prior to my joining ABS as their Chief Technology Officer. In Dr. Lim's opening slides, he did talk about the impact of the IMO and in particular the Marine Environmental Protection Committee, or the MEPC, in their meeting this July to talk about the future of decarbonization and carbon intensity. MEPC 80 had a document released called the Resolution 377. And I think both of the prior speakers did an excellent job talking about the reduction of the greenhouse gas targets. But one thing that happened at that meeting is kind of a throwaway almost, was a comment about how the marine industry will handle its carbon accounting for carbon intensity going forward. To this point, carbon intensity was calculated from the tank of the vessel through its wake. We would call that tank to wake, meaning if you were using a decarbonized fuel, whether that be a biofuel, ammonia, hydrogen, or other alternative, the method by which it got into the bunker situation for the vessel was immaterial. What that meant was the broad industry availability for potential fuels like ammonia were at the option for ship owners to use in their new designs. At MEPC 80 this summer, something changed. The statement in the resolution was we are not going to shift the accounting of the carbon in the production of the fuel to other industries. And the implication is that there is a new carbon intensity factor to be calculated accounting for the well to the tank. The specific mathematics for that won't be available for a few more months. My understanding is that it is coming out in March, but it did change the game for the future fuels discussion in the maritime industry. And what that did was it elevated the importance of nuclear energy in the production of those fuels. So when we think about future fuels for maritime, we think about them with this color scale that you see on the slides. If the fuel is coming from coal, we will typically call that brown hydrogen, brown ammonia, etc. If it's coming from the steam methane reformation of liquefied natural gas, which is the majority of hydrogen production today, we call that gray. And then blue is using carbon capture, green using renewable energy sources, solar or wind, and then pink, the use of nuclear energy in the production of these fuels. To this point, what we have today, 99% of alternative fuel production today is either brown or gray. Less than 1% is blue or green. What we would anticipate is then the demand for these types of fuels in the future to account for the new carbon scoring of the maritime industry going forward will increase its demand and therefore its cost, making nuclear energy's production of these alternative fuels more and more viable. On the chart behind me, you'll see the carbon contribution for greenhouse gas well-to-wake and greenhouse gas tank-to-wake. And as you can see, the gray and the brown flavors of hydrogen or ammonia or similar fuels can be worse than even using those fuels strictly in the tank from a total carbon emissions perspective. And this is what's changed the game for maritime more, I think, this year than anything else. So as we think about the use cases for nuclear energy in maritime, we see at ABS two pathways. We see the pathway for the production of green fuels in an offshore basis, whether that's an offshore production plant. Think about a floating production, storage, and transit offshore, an FPSO offshore that produces alternative fuels using electrolysis from electricity produced by a nuclear reactor. We see as maybe the first type of products that will enter our industry. And then, of course, what I think everyone thinks about, and what we saw on Mr. Lee's very good presentation, was an arrangement for a ship using nuclear electric propulsion. And I'll talk about both of those topics in my remaining remarks. At ABS, one of the things that we do are we develop rules for the vessel. We won't license the reactor, we won't license the nuclear energy source, but all the requirements around the safety of the vessel will ultimately come from one of the IACS class societies. So for us, informing how we go about and produce those requirements, we needed something to work on. So we contracted a designer in the United States to start to do some studies for us. And one of the things we started with was a 14K TEU container vessel with nuclear power. In this case, it wasn't a molten salt, it was a molten lead reactor, arranged for us by a European reactor design firm, gave us space, gave us weight, gave us energy requirements. We shared that information with the designer to come up with the concept. My expectation, having designed nuclear vessels for over 2 decades, was that we would lose payload fraction, that it would adversely impact the ability of the vessel to carry cargo. And what we learned was that is not the case. It's the opposite. In this particular design, the payload carrying capacity of this concept design went up by 9%. And the speed in this case was held the same, with a 20-year life of core to allow that vessel to operate without bunkering fuel for 20 years. So from an economic and opportunistic perspective for this type of ship, we see it as a very optimistic, very promising, very encouraging design for us. It also allows us, again, to talk about safety and talk about the kind of things and write the kind of rules that the industry will need to support designs of vessels like this. From an overall benefit perspective, from a particular ship, I mentioned you get some payload fraction, you get no bunkering, you get some opportunities. When you think about some of the offshore opportunities, the use of land to produce nuclear reactors is mitigated by taking the energy source and moving it offshore. I think Dr. Lee also included in his wheel of risks the seismic concern. Certainly more focus since the Fukushima event than it had been prior to that, but the water column itself for a floating offshore structure provides a natural separation for that type of seismic event. So an inherent safety opportunity by going to offshore. And of course, we can start to use the infinite heat sink. We can use the sea as feedstock for hydrogen or for ammonia fuels as opportunities for why you would want to move the nuclear energy source into an offshore setting. And then, of course, one thing that we should always keep in mind is the use of this energy to support society. And we think about where humans live, some 70% of them live within 100 kilometers of the sea. So using the opportunity of the sea to provide energy source for society is another excellent benefit for the concept of nuclear power. But with any great opportunity comes challenges. And we think about these challenges in 4 quadrants. We think about the safety challenge first and foremost. As a class society, this is most important to us. Regulatory, of course, will be quite the interesting challenge, and one of the reasons why we do think that the offshore opportunity will be the first that we'll see when we look at the time span of nuclear energy and maritime. And that is primarily driven by the regulatory concerns of whether I have just a single nation-state, flag state, or coastal state that will license the reactor versus a vessel that will transit between nations and will have to have regulatory adoption by both the flag state as well as the receiving port state for where that vessel trades. Of course, operational challenges are abundant. We have them at the shipyards and during construction itself. How will ports allow for the use of nuclear reactors? There is lots of interesting opportunity in allowing the vessel to reverse cold iron or send energy into the port to support electric vehicles and electrification of cranes and others. And then what I think many of us think about when we think about nuclear energy as a challenge to adoption are the commercial and social elements. What does society really think about having a nuclear reactor in a port community which today is more densely populated than many of the typical terrestrial sites that are used to support urban power generation? I think something that's optimistic coming from the United States, and I am old enough to remember the drills that we would have in elementary school where we would practice duck and cover to protect ourselves from attack from the then Soviet Union. And it created this feeling of nuclear energy is dangerous. And I think that over the more than 40 years since that practice ended, a lot of that attitude has started to change. It comes from the application and availability of smartphones for the next generation, and it comes from the challenge of decarbonization as being first and foremost on the mind of our young generation and the young people in our society today. And this attitude that nuclear is dangerous has been obviated by the fact that it actually is a fantastic safety rating, a safety record, a safety history. And in fact, compared with many of the other hydrocarbon industries, nuclear energy is very, very safe. And we think we have the technology to ensure that safety record going forward as it enters into the maritime domain. So from a regulatory demand perspective, we think about how does the role of licensing overlap, combine, but the importance of classification. One of the things that we see as an IAC society at the American Bureau of Shipping, our role is to help bridge the gap between the nuclear industry and the maritime industry and bring industries together that haven't spoken for many, many years to help with the regulations that are going to be needed and the unique challenges of putting a reactor at sea where it's subjected to motions, subjected to a more corrosive seawater environment, and ensure that the design elements of the nuclear plant consider maritime, but then also the design of ships consider the additional weight, consider the special arrangements for shielding, and other unique characteristics of a nuclear reactor at sea. For us, the next steps in classification will be the production of those very important rules or requirements for nuclear-powered ships. At the American Bureau of Shipping, this work is underway. We are funded primarily by the United States Department of Energy to evaluate what those requirements will look like, and we expect publication in the first half of 2024, next year, just a few months away. For us, we're very proud of where that stands now, and we think that will very much help enable the industry to begin to produce designs on the maritime side that will support a nuclear energy transition. And this isn't the first time that ABS has done this. In 1963, under President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, the United States built a nuclear-powered commercial ship called the USNS Savannah. The Savannah sailed for about 7 years. It's just a demonstration platform of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. It was a pressurized water reactor in that case. It was owned by the government, by the Department of Transportation at the United States, called the Maritime Administration, or we say MARAD. And that vessel is still available to go visit today as a museum ship in Baltimore, in Maryland. That ship then, in 1963, to this day, as a museum ship, has been classed by ABS. And ABS produced the rules for which that vessel was designed back in the early 1960s. I've had the opportunity to actually read those rules, and you might be surprised. It's a very thin book compared to the type of requirement documents that we produce today, many, many pages, but it's actually quite good. And they used an approach called goal-based standards that will likely be the basis for our approach today. We know that there's lots of demand in industry for prescriptive rules, where you say exactly what you need to do. But because of the continued evolution and the multiple types of reactors, it would take longer to wait and define prescriptive rules than goal-based standards. So that work is underway today at ABS, and I will be excited to come back next year about this time and tell you all about those rules as they will have been published by then. So I do encourage everyone, please, if you have questions about class, come talk to me. If you want to know more about what we're doing, work with us on research and development of our rules or topics. ABS is happy to do that kind of work. With that, I thank you very much. I look forward to the panel discussion coming up. And Dr. Lim, I will turn it back over to you to introduce our next speaker. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Patrick Ryan. I believe his speech gives us a clear idea about why we need the nuclear energy for the ship or marine area, and also he highlighted the benefit and challenges that we are facing for the use of the nuclear energy in the area of marine industry or shipbuilding. So please give another big hand for his nice presentation.